In Praise of Placido by Ciro Discepolo from the book The Great Treatise on Astrology, 2nd edition, Milan, Ricerca, 784 pages. The issue of domification is not of negligible importance. Ultimately, much of predictive astrology depends on it, since it focuses on concrete facts rather than highly abstract and unverifiable concepts. It must ensure that every piece fits into the overall mosaic of an event. This, interpreted from an astrological perspective, if one possesses the right skill, is something marvelous in its logic, which I would dare to call geometric. I won't begin this discussion of domification from scratch, because I assume that the reader who is following me has come to this volume after having attended elementary and high school in astrology. In my new guide to astrology, published by Armenia, there is a short but I believe comprehensive chapter that explains the basic concepts of astronomy of astrological interest and allows us to understand what we are going to say below. For those wishing to delve further into these concepts, other specific texts are listed in the bibliography. Below you will find some graphs and formulas that support this discussion, graphs explained in the cited text, and formulas that refer to the wonderful Dictionary of Astrology by Henri J. Gouchon, published by Armenia. There are truly numerous house systems, and I believe more are still being created every year, so I have not kept an updated count of them. Here, however, I will refer to the three most famous and quite ancient systems: Placidus, Regiomontanus, and Campanus. I will also mention Koch. I will, however, not even consider those systems such as Equalis and the like, which anyone, even casting their mother-in-law's horoscope, could instantly discover to be false, because a star would shockingly shift from its proper position in the correct house to a purely imaginary one. Naturally, I say this with full respect for those who think differently, but I also cannot silence my own strong convictions on the matter. The reader, the scholar in progress, must make an important choice, and after reading everything possible from each author, it is best to choose one as a teacher and follow him for the most part, even if not necessarily embracing all of his theses. It goes without saying, however, that it would be quite impractical, for example, to follow the Discepolo school while simultaneously adopting the domification of equal houses. In writing the following notes, I also referred to Dieter Koch's excellent article, How to Guide Our Choice Among the Various Astrological House Systems, published in issue 103, summer 1996, of Linguaggio Astrale, published by CDA, Turin, an excellent translation from the original by Anna Bagnis Mazzoli. First of all, I'd like to clear up a false prejudice. It's commonly said that those who use Placido do so out of ignorance of the various systems and a sort of lazy acquiescence to tradition. It's also said that Placido's success is largely due to his having found in ancient times a publisher willing to sponsor his system. I disagree with either of these two assertions, and I'll try to explain why. First of all, as far as I'm concerned, this alleged ignorance of other systems never existed, because in the very early years of my astrology studies, I worked extensively on the primary directions, following the two French texts by Gouchon that appear in the bibliography, the Simplified Primary Directions and the Simplified Annual Horoscope, Derville Livre, Paris. For his method, Gouchon, whom I regard as one of the best astrologers of all time, argued that the Regiomontan house system was more correct, and in the years I dedicated to this topic, years filled with calculations, trigonometric formulas and arcs, semi-arcs of circumferences, and so on, I had the opportunity to thoroughly evaluate the differences that the calculations performed with the two house systems led me to, while also knowing the differences with the third. I am also convinced that Placidus's good fortune lay not only in having found a publisher, but also in having devised the system better than others. In fact, as we will shortly see, he did not devise the method, but he nevertheless had the great merit of popularizing it. Personally, I believe that Placidus's system of domification is the best for our work and our research for two fundamental reasons. It is the one that, in my opinion, best fits the celestial logic that surrounds us and offers a tangible and credible representation of the motion of the planets around us and of the division we make of the diurnal and nocturnal arcs in relation to that motion. I believe that consciously or unconsciously, over the centuries of astrological practice that preceded us, a sort of calibration has developed between man and the system of measurement adopted, such that the one interacts with the other. Since they exist in symbiosis, it would be harmful to alter this system, which is also based, if you like, on the concept expounded by Jung in his book Synchronicity, according to which the observer ultimately influences the outcome of the research. This is a truly difficult concept to explain, but I'll try anyway later. Now I'll immediately explain the technical reason why I consider Placido superior to other methods, and then we'll go into the details. Placido, of the three systems analyzed here, is the only one based on the division of time. For example, the time it takes for the sun, in geocentric observation, to move from rising, ascendant, to culminating, midheaven, and then to setting, descendant, and not on space. To simplify the matter to a great extent, but we'll delve deeper into it later, we can say that, for example, if we count the time it takes the sun to pass from the ascendant to the midheaven, and divide it into 3 equal parts, we will obtain the cusps of the 10th, 11th, and 1st houses, with circumferential arcs that aren't necessarily equal, but starting from 3 identical times. In the other two systems, however, we don't consider time, which seems to me to be the fundamental variable in this context, but rather space. Here's how Dieter Koch, who has nothing to do with his namesake, the inventor of the 4th system analyzed in this chapter, eruditely explains the differences between the 3 systems. Dieter Koch clearly favors the Campanian system and explains the reasons below. The houses, according to Campanus. Let's now move on to the system of unequal houses. The Campanian system is truly suited to the spatial relationships on Earth. It is also the oldest to meet this requirement, as well as the simplest and clearest, and takes its name from the Italian mathematician and geometer Giovanni Campano, 1233-1296, who apparently discovered it. Imagine standing up facing south and dividing the celestial vault above us from west to east into 6 orange segments of equal width, corresponding to the houses from the 7th to the 12th. Where the subdivisions cut the zodiac are the cusps of the houses according to Campano, which are indicated in the horoscope. The same procedure for the celestial vault is applied to the houses below the horizon, and thus we obtain the houses from the 1st to the 6th. The houses are only apparently unequal when marked on the zodiac, but in reality they are segments of the sky of equal size, therefore there is no distortion. It is such a simple matter that it requires no particular illustration. Peel an orange and cut it in half, Place one half on the table and orient its axis from north to south. The only table I know of relating to Campanus's domification is the one in Michel Barbier's House of Tables, according to Campanus and Regiomontanus. Librairie des Sources, Geneva, 1978. What are the characteristics of this system? It is a solid sphere with the individual at its center, divided in two by the horizon and further structured according to the directions of the planet's culmination. South, MC. The Campanus system offers an extremely clear picture of spatial relationships. I find myself at the center of a sphere and simply need to locate in which sector a planet is located while simultaneously experiencing the sensation of understanding more and being in control of the situation. The Campanus method gives me solidity, security, and clarity. Since I always find myself at the center of the celestial sphere, I have the impression that the sky becomes a kind of aura for me, a part of myself, fully available to me. These are, however, my personal impressions. It seems to me that the Campanian system is particularly suited to indicating to man where he stands in an earthly relationship and where the forces he can utilize in life on earth lie. Stable in eternity, there's another aspect of particular significance. We see the sky as a crystal sphere with 12 segments of equal size, and all the celestial bodies move through these segments throughout the day. It is as if we were standing still and motionless in eternity, simply observing how everything moves around us. This is the point of view of the sage, who observes from above but also penetratingly, without ever getting lost in anything fleeting. He remains an immovable rock in the changing times. A constant criticism of the Campanian system is that it ignores time and is simply a subdivision of space. It remains to be seen that one is still oriented south, but that south is defined by the Earth's rotation, which is to say by movement. Time is therefore not entirely neglected. The Campanian system is truly a calm gaze on time and its changes. Indeed, it is true calm. It observes while remaining still, but observes time. For this reason, I prefer the Campanian system over all other possible methods. It is the purest expression of a clear awareness, firmly rooted both in the soil of the earth and in eternity, in infinite time. Or more modestly, this system corresponds better to my moon and my ascendant in the sign of Taurus. A further argument against the Campanian system could be that with this method at higher geographic latitudes, the planets are statistically found much more frequently in the 12th, 1st, 6th, and 7th houses than in all other houses. In areas near the equator, the distribution is more or less balanced, but the further north or south you move, and the lower the path of the sun and the planets, the more accentuated the indicated inequality becomes. In contrast with the Placidus system, statistics yield uniform results. To this observation, I would respond that inequality is already present in nature, precisely because for us who live at higher latitudes, the sun and the planets move along inclined orbits and always illuminate us obliquely from the south, never vertically from above. It would be interesting to investigate whether, as latitude increases, the houses and the encounter axis, ASDS, somehow take on greater significance in the subject's life. Let's now look, again according to Koch, at the strengths and weaknesses of the Regiomontanus and Placidus methods. The houses of Regiomontanus, this system takes its name from the German mathematician, astronomer, and astrologer Regiomontanus, Johannes Müller, 1434–76, although it appears to have been discovered by a Spanish Jew named Avanestra, 1090–1167. It would therefore be an older method than the Campanian method, which it countered with great success during the time of Regiomontanus. We must once again turn toward the south and once again divide the sky into orange segments, but this time they will no longer be equal. Let's first describe the celestial equator, that is, the circle the sun roughly travels at the equinoxes when it rises exactly in the east and sets exactly in the west, marking its culmination point at exactly noon on these dates. Its altitude is 90 degrees minus our geographic latitude. We then divide this semicircle into 6 equal parts and construct our orange segments so that each occupies exactly 1/6 of the space. According to Regiomontanus, the points at which the zodiac is cut correspond to the cusps of the houses. The portions of the sky thus determined have different dimensions. The tables according to this system can be found in the aforementioned book by Michel Barbey. A complicated idea, we can note that this method is rather complicated and does not seem as simple and clear as the Campanian one. In that case, for example, we could state that the cusp of the 12th house lies on the zodiac exactly on the edge of 1/6 of the division of celestial space. And it seems like a sensible statement. In the case of the Regiomontan system, we should instead express it this way. The degree of the zodiac corresponding to the cusp of the 12th house is located on a line with the first sixth of the celestial equator and the point where south lies on the horizon. But what meaning does this have? How can we interpret it from an astrological perspective? The equal-sized parts on the celestial equator also correspond to an equivalent temporal division of the day into 12 double hours. Evidently, this system seeks, unlike the Campanian one, to focus not so much on space, but on time and movement. Strictly speaking, it is an attempt to divide the space of the sky according to a regular measurement of time. But the execution leaves much to be desired. It remains difficult, for example, to understand what the degree of the zodiac on which the cusp of the 11th or 12th house is located has to do with the double hours. And from a purely spatial perspective, these points don't seem justified. This clearly constitutes a weakness of this system. Houses, according to Placido, the system of the Italian monk Placidus de Titis, 1590-1668, was not actually invented by him, but was taught shortly before Placidus's time by a certain Maginus, far from unknown in Italy. On the contrary, he was the author of the Ephemerides used in Galileo's time, a copy of which was kept in his library. Editor's note: it is constructed with the following criteria. One must look toward the south, observing how the sky rotates, with all the stars and planets. Thus we can see that all celestial bodies move in concentric circular orbits of varying sizes according to a pattern similar to that shown on the face of a disk. This effect can be observed in astronomical photographs of the sky exposed to light for long periods. All these circles are parallel to the celestial equator, that is, the circle the sun travels at the equinoxes. According to Placidus, the cusp of the 12th house is therefore that point on the zodiac that has already traveled 1/3 of its journey from the horizon to the culmination point. If the sun is located at this point, it has already traveled 1/3 of its journey upward. The 11th cusp therefore corresponds to 2/3 of the aforementioned journey toward culmination. The second and third cusps are those points of the zodiac that have traveled 1 or 2/3 of the journey between the celestial circle and the horizon. By indicating on a celestial map all the points that have already traveled 1, 2, 4, or 5 sixths of their daily movement, 12th, 11th, 9th, and 8th houses, we obtain 4 curved lines, well proportioned across the sky. It is appropriate for the reader to momentarily ignore the anomalies that occur in the region near the poles. Let us compare Placidus's thesis with that of Campanus. According to Campano, the sun on the cusp of the 12th house means that it has reached the boundary between the first and second upper sectors of the sky. We therefore receive an indication of its position. In the case of Placidus, however, the information is as follows. The sun has completed 1/3 of its ascending path in the visible sky. This is therefore a different piece of information. In the 3 sectors defined by Campano, the sun moves at different times as it crosses them at different angles, while it uses the same amount of time to travel through the 3 sectors indicated by Placidus. The information we receive therefore relates to how far the sun has traveled on its path. Campano focuses on position and space, while Placidus focuses on path and time. Placidus's system therefore follows the perspective of the individual who perceives himself as a creature bound to time and movement. In this case, the progressive evolution of life is put in the foreground. The Campano system, on the other hand, is rooted in a timeless dimension and is not influenced by movement. Personally, I consider the Campanian method preferable, even though most astrologers follow Placidus's or Koch's method. Time and celestial space, it would seem that Placidus found a way to divide the sky according to time. However, he had to abandon the idea of a fixed measurement of time, as we find in Regiomontanus with the double hours. It's not so much the time itself that matters, but rather the phases relating to 1/3 of its path. Let's observe the path of the sun. In midsummer the day is longer than the night, and the sun travels a longer portion of its path above the horizon than below. This means that it takes longer for the 12th to 7th houses than for the 6th to 1st. From this we can see that the segments of the sun's path, according to Placidus, do not correspond to fixed units of time or path, such as hours or degrees, that is, to absolute values, but are only relative quantities, namely 1/6 of the daily or nightly path, which have different measurements and change, depending on the season or the celestial body to which they refer. Only the equator is divided into segments corresponding to 2 hours each. It follows that it cannot be said that Placidus's system follows a precise measure of time, as Regiomontanus does, since every point in the sky has its own measure of time. Everything is relative, and each point follows its own individual path. Placidus therefore corresponds very well to the spirit of our time, characterized by relativity and a constantly shifting perspective. End of quote from Koch's article. It is precisely this characteristic that I find preferable in Placidus's system compared to others, not a negative value but rather an asset. In my opinion, Placidus best represents the sky as seen by us, in its apparent and relative evolution, exactly as it is in the very concept of astrology, where the point of observation, humanity, cannot and should not be outside the observed system, but must be an intimate part of it. However, as I said at the beginning of this chapter, I do not intend to compete with colleagues who wish to start a technical dispute about the validity of the systems presented here. This is the method that convinces me most in relation to my needs as an astrologer, and I recommend it to anyone who wishes to follow me. This is while respecting any contrary and or differing opinions. As for the Koch system, Walter A. Koch, classical and esoteric philologist, 1895-1970. It is also time-based, like Placidus, but rather than relating it to the time taken by the sun to pass from the ascendant to the midheaven, and then dividing it into 3 equal parts, it calculates the time taken by the degree of the MC to move along the ecliptic. Dieter Koch himself, not to be confused with the author of the method, asks in the aforementioned article, why attach such great importance to the degree of the midheaven? Wouldn't it make more sense, as in the case of Placidus, to measure the time elapsed from sunrise relative to the time it takes for the sun to travel from the horizon to the south? Read midheaven, editor's note. After a third of this time, it would be on the cusp of the 12th house. Many believe that the Koch system became widespread among Anglo-Americans because it promises to be able to domify even at very high latitudes, unlike Placidus, beyond the Arctic and Antarctic circles. And perhaps many Americans and English who use it believe this too. I believed it too, having not done any tests out of laziness. Then I did them in the column edited by Luigi Galli and myself in Ricerca 90, and this sort of urban legend was completely debunked. See Ricerca 90 No. 50, April 2002. At this point, the question really arises, what purpose could the Koch domification system really serve? Let's move on to the second step to try to explain the other reason why I feel I support the system popularized by the Benedictine monk. I'd say we should start with one of the basic objections leveled at us by astrology's opponents. Why do you consider the birth chart and not the conception chart? Well, because astrology has been structured over the centuries based on the observation of the stars at the moment of birth. Nothing would prevent us from creating a new astrology based on the moment of conception, assuming it were always possible to determine it precisely. But in that case, we would have to wait a few thousand years to calibrate the system to the new variables. Similarly, the Placidus system has become rooted in our astrology, at least in recent centuries, and if we wanted to refer to another system, in my opinion, we would have to recalibrate the whole thing. At this point, it's necessary to ask, but if different systems exist, what guarantee can we have that each of them actually works? The same question can be applied to Indian astrology or to Chinese, Aztec, etc. And here we come to the heart of what I mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, the interaction between humanity and the system of prediction, which is also known as self-fulfilling prediction. In a certain sense, we might say we are on quicksand, in the sense of Western thought. An important example of this can be found in Carl Gustav Jung's book on synchronicity, when the great Zurich thinker wondered whether, in the astrological experiment on couples, he might have unintentionally influenced the outcome of the experiment itself. Jung wondered, in other words, whether with regard to astrology and so-called paranormal phenomena in general, it is more appropriate to classify them within the realm of physical phenomena and cause and effect, or as expressions of synchronicity. And he also wondered precisely whether the observer-observed fact system was a one-way, impermeable system. Here are 2 quotes on this subject from my friend and colleague Enzo Barilla, taken from Carl A. Meyer, The Pauli-Jung Correspondence, Il Minotauro, Rome, 1999. Modern microphysics, in fact, considers the observer, his psyche first and foremost, as a king of the microcosm, who manages the observed facts at will, and who therefore conditions them temporally and spatially, even if they were sometimes immaterial, extra corpus. letter from Pauli to Jung, 23/12, so 947. Until recently in physics, causalism and statistics guaranteed, so to speak, the repetition of the phenomenon, because the unrepeatable phenomenon was considered scientifically invalid. But there is one thing now, as we have seen, that cannot be reproduced: the psychic condition of the observer, whose influence on the phenomenon itself cannot in reality be eliminated. It is, to define it, a statistical variant that would in effect render the phenomena unrepeatable. Letter from Pauli to Jung, November 24th, 1950. Let us remember that Wolfgang Pauli, 1900-1958, was an eminent atomic physicist, the discoverer of the neutrino and the winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1914. Let us also recall that in her learned lectures at the annual astrology conference in Vico Equense, http www.cirodiscepolo.it Riceum in 94 on HDM, our excellent friend and colleague Luciana Marinangeli made several references to what I am explaining, as well as in her article published in Ricerca 90 number 51, January 2001, as a preface to Mario Moreno's essay Parapsychology in Jung's work. In short, I am profoundly convinced that a particular resonance is created between the observer of a phenomenon and the phenomenon itself, to the extent that the observer ends up validating his own observational instrument and measurement, and this will also work by virtue of this special harmony. Therefore, I cannot imagine that one morning a student of mine waking up would decide to use active astrology and all its rules, but completely change the house system used until now, and borrow from that moment on the Campanian house system, the Regiomontan house system, or another of his choosing. The calibration, which, as far as I'm concerned, lasted many years and led me to conclude that one must always stay at least 2.5 degrees away from a dangerous house cusp, would have to be completely revised. And not only that, if I decided to adopt a different house system than the Placidus one. Similarly, I believe Indian astrologers are capable of producing extremely precise predictions, but using their measuring instruments. That is an astrology that, among other things, was born and structured in a territory where, unlike the Mediterranean area, there are seasons consisting of 6 months of rain and as many months of drought.